The sun had not yet risen over Lake Weir in Florida. It was 5:30 in the morning, January 16th, 1935. The air was thick with the smell of swamp water and pine needles. A heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling the sound of the crickets. To anyone passing by, the white two-story cottage by the water looked like the perfect retirement dream. A place where you go to fish, sit on the porch, and forget the world. But inside the tall grass surrounding the house, the world had not forgotten. 14 men lay on their stomachs in the wet dirt. They were not fishermen. They were agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they were not holding fishing rods. They were gripping Thompson submachine guns, automatic rifles, and tear gas launchers. They were waiting for a signal. Inside the house, everything was still. In the upstairs bedroom, a 61-year-old woman was likely just waking up. She was short, stout, and had the kind of face you would expect to see baking pies at a church fundraiser. She wore long skirts and tied her graying hair back in a sensible bun. Her neighbors knew her as a nice old lady who loved jigsaw puzzles and listening to the radio. But the men in the grass knew something else. They knew that inside her handbag, next to her reading glasses, sat a loaded .45 caliber automatic pistol. They knew that the nice son sleeping down the hall was a man who had kidnapped bankers and shot sheriffs. And they knew that this grandmother didn't believe in surrender. The silence broke with a shout. An agent cupped his hands and yelled at the white cottage, "Come out! You are surrounded!" For a moment, the only answer was the wind in the trees. The agents tightened their grip on the cold steel of their weapons. Then, a voice floated out from the house. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a calm, defiant statement. "All right, go ahead." The first shot didn't come from the FBI. It came from an upper window. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from an agent's face. And then, the morning exploded. For the next 4 hours, that quiet vacation home turned into a majestic, terrifying fireworks display. The FBI agents opened fire. Windows shattered instantly. Wood splinters flew into the air like confetti. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that could be heard miles away in the nearest town. It wasn't a precision operation, it was a siege. By the time the smoke cleared, the agents had fired more than 2,000 rounds of ammunition into the house. 2,000. The walls were so riddled with holes they looked like Swiss cheese. The furniture inside was reduced to kindling. It remains the longest shootout in FBI history. And all of this firepower, all of this coordination, all of this destruction was for one old woman and her son. When the news hit the papers the next day, the American public was stunned. How? How does a grandmother from the Ozark Mountains become the most wanted fugitive in America? How does a woman born in a log cabin end up dying in a hail of government lead holding a submachine gun? History remembers her as a monster. J. Edgar Hoover called her the criminal mastermind behind the most ruthless gang of the Depression era. But to understand why she was in that house and why she refused to walk out, we have to look past the FBI reports. We have to look past the headlines. We have to go back to the mud where it all started, because Kate Barker didn't become a gangster in a city. She was forged in a place where the law of the land was written in blood. To understand the end of Ma Barker, you have to understand her beginning. And her beginning wasn't in the roaring 20s or the gangster-filled streets of Chicago. It was here, in the deep, rolling timber of the Ozark Mountains. Geographically, the Ozarks are in Missouri and Arkansas, but culturally, they are the spiritual twin of Appalachia. In the late 19th century, this was a place that time and the government seemed to have forgotten. Imagine a world without paved roads, no electricity, no telephone lines connecting you to the nearest town. The valleys were deep and shadowed, cut off from the rest of America by steep limestone bluffs. If you lived here in the 1870s, your world was only as big as your horse could ride in a day. The people who settled these hills were Scots-Irish immigrants. They were tough, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of anyone they didn't know. They brought with them a code from the old country, a code that said, you handle your own problems. If someone steals your pig, you don't call the police. You grab your rifle and you go get your pig. And maybe you burn down their barn for good measure. But there was something else in the soil here, something bitter. Arizona Donnie Clark, the woman who would become Ma Barker, was born in 1873. This was less than a decade after the Civil War ended. But in the Ozarks, the war never really ended. During the Civil War, Missouri was a nightmare. It wasn't just armies fighting on battlefields, it was neighbor killing neighbor. Guerrilla warfare. Men like Bloody Bill Anderson and William Quantrill roamed these woods, burning homesteads and hanging sympathizers from the oak trees. When the war officially ended in 1865, the hate didn't just evaporate, it seeped into the ground. The men who had ridden with the guerrillas went home, but they didn't stop being fighters. They just changed their targets. They looked at the banks, the railroads, and the politicians in the cities, and they saw the enemy. They saw Yankee oppressors coming to take their land and tax their whiskey. In these hills, the sheriff wasn't a protector. He was just a man from a rival clan with a badge. He was the tax collector. He was the outsider. To the hill people, the law was just a tool the rich used to crush the poor. And this is the atmosphere little Arizona breathed in every day. She didn't grow up hearing bedtime stories about knights and dragons. She grew up hearing stories about the James Younger gang, about outlaws who hid in these very caves. The local preacher might have talked about turning the other cheek on Sunday morning. But Monday through Saturday, the lesson was very different. The lesson was, protect your kin. Trust no one outside the bloodline. And if the government comes knocking, you don't open the door. You load the shotgun. It was a hard life, a life of dirt floors, calloused hands, and early graves. Survival wasn't guaranteed. If the crops failed, you starved. If you got sick, you died, or you toughed it out. Weakness was a death sentence. And in this world of hard men and silent women, a little girl named Arizona was watching everything. She absorbed this bitterness like a sponge. She saw how the men with the guns commanded respect. She saw how the outlaws were treated like folk heroes, given free meals and fresh horses by the locals. She looked at her own life, the mud, the chores, the poverty, and she made a decision. She didn't want to be the victim. She didn't want to be the farmer's wife who worked until her back broke. She wanted something else. Her name was Arizona Donnie Clark. They called her Ari. And for the first 16 years of her life, she was just another poor Ozark girl. Her days were a repeating cycle of hard labor, hauling water from the well, mending clothes until her fingers were sore, tending to the chickens and the pigs. It was a life dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, a life with no escape. But one day, the routine was broken. The story goes that she was outside, shaking a rug, when she heard a sound. It wasn't the slow, plodding sound of a farmer's mule. It was the thunder of a dozen fast horses coming down the dirt road. She froze. In these hills, unexpected visitors were rarely good news. The riders came into view. They were hard-faced men in dusty coats. Their horses were sleek and powerful, not the tired work animals she was used to seeing. And they carried their rifles not in saddle scabbards, but in their hands, as if they were an extension of their arms. They stopped at the Clark family well for water. Ari watched from the porch, hidden in the shadows, and she saw him. The man leading them was Jesse James. At that time, Jesse James was the most famous man in America. To the newspapers in the East, he was a devil, a cold-blooded killer. But in the hills of Missouri, he was something else entirely. He was a hero. He was Robin Hood. He was the man who was still fighting the war against the rich and powerful. Imagine being a young girl, trapped in a world of gray poverty, and suddenly seeing a living legend. He wasn't just a man. He was an idea, the idea of freedom, the idea that you didn't have to accept the hand you were dealt. You could take what you wanted. She watched as her father, a man who bowed to no one, spoke to Jesse James with a quiet respect. They didn't see a criminal, they saw a soldier, a champion of their cause. When the gang rode away, disappearing back into the forest, something inside Ari Clark had changed forever. The world was no longer just about survival. It was about power. It was about defiance. Jesse James didn't look like a man who was afraid of the bank or the sheriff or starvation. He looked like a king. That image was burned into her mind. It became her ideal, the man she would look for, the life she would crave, a life of adventure, of risk, of respect, earned not through hard work, but through sheer nerve. She grew into a young woman. She was known for being intensely religious, a regular churchgoer who could quote scripture by heart. But behind the pious exterior, the dream of the outlaw king was still simmering. She looked for her Jesse James in the faces of the local boys. She looked for a man with fire in his eyes and a rejection of the rules. She wanted a hero who would blast them out of their poverty and into a life of legend. But the Ozarks weren't filled with legendary outlaws. They were filled with farmers and laborers. She wanted a hero, but she settled for a George. In 1892, at the age of 19, Arizona Donnie Clark married a man named George Barker. On the surface, he was a good match. He was a tenant farmer, a quiet and hard-working man. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He was, by all accounts, a kind and gentle soul who wanted nothing more than a peaceful life. For Arizona, this was a disaster. She had dreamed of a man like Jesse James, a man who bent the world to his will. Instead, she got a man who was bent by the world. George was poor, and he seemed resigned to it. He accepted his lot in life. He worked from sunup to sundown for a landlord, and at the end of the year, they barely had enough to get by. To Arizona, his quiet acceptance felt like weakness. His gentleness felt like cowardice. Every time he came home, hands raw and back aching, she didn't see a provider. She saw a failure, a man who let the world walk all over him. The contempt began to fester, but she found a new purpose. Between 1894 and 1903, she gave birth to 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred. And in them, she saw a second chance. If her husband was too weak to fight the world, her boys would not be. If George was a lamb, her sons would be wolves. She poured all of her ambition, all of her resentment, all of her dreams of outlaw glory into them. As the boys grew, the family was in constant motion. They moved from one rented shack to another across Missouri, following whatever work George could find. They were always poor. The boys often went without shoes. The shame of it ate at Arizona. She became known as Kate, a tougher, harder name. George tried to raise his sons to be like him, to be honest, to be hard-working. He would take them to church, trying to instill a sense of morality. But his quiet words were no match for their mother's powerful influence. She taught them a different gospel, the gospel of the Ozarks. She told them stories of the James Gang. She taught them that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, the takers and the taken, and the Barkers would be takers. She looked at her sons and made a vow. They would never be poor like their father. They would never be weak. They would never have to bow their heads to anyone, no matter the cost. The family dynamic became clear. George was the father, but Kate was the leader. He was the figurehead. She was the power. When the boys got into trouble at school, George might try to discipline them, but Kate would intervene. She'd defend them fiercely. She'd tell them the teacher was wrong, the system was rigged, that they were special, and the world was just trying to hold them down. She wasn't just raising sons, she was forging weapons. She was creating the outlaws she could never be, the Jesse James she could never find. Her love was absolute, unconditional, and blinding. In her eyes, her boys could do no wrong. It was always somebody else's fault. George, overwhelmed and undermined, slowly faded into the background of his own family. He became a ghost in his own home, a silent witness to the darkness his wife was nurturing in his children. The cost of Kate's vow would be paid sooner than anyone thought, and it wouldn't be paid in dollars and cents. The trouble started small, as it always does. A stolen pie from a windowsill, a neighbor's chicken disappearing from a coop. At first it was dismissed as boyhood mischief, but with the Barker boys the mischief had a harder edge. It wasn't about fun, it was about contempt. When a farmer came to the Barker home to complain that his tools had vanished from his barn, he didn't get an apology. He got Kate. She would storm onto the porch, her eyes blazing, and accuse him of lying. She'd claim he was just trying to cause trouble for her family because they were poor. She was so ferocious, so certain, that the man would often leave confused and intimidated, wondering if he'd made a mistake. The boys watched this performance again and again. The lesson was clear: never admit anything, never back down. The world is your enemy, and Mom is your shield. But the pranks soon escalated into something the whole town couldn't ignore. There's a story they still tell in that part of Missouri. It's about a local man who had done well for himself. He built a new house, and in a town of rough-hewn cabins, he installed large, beautiful glass windows. To the Barkers, those windows weren't just glass. They were an insult, a symbol of everything they didn't have. One night, the four boys crept up to the house. There was no plan to steal anything. The goal was simpler. It was destruction. They picked up rocks, and for 10 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic, sickening crash of shattering glass. It was a declaration of war on the man's small happiness. The next morning, the town constable came to the Barker's door. George met him on the porch, his face a mask of shame. He was ready to pay for the damage, to make his sons apologize, to fix this. But he never got the chance. Kate pushed past him. She stood there, a short, stout woman in an apron, and she faced down the law. She didn't yell this time. Her voice was cold. She told the constable he had no proof. She told him he was persecuting her children. She hinted that if he kept pushing, he might just have an accident on one of those dark country roads. It wasn't a defense. It was a threat. The constable, a man used to dealing with petty drunks and property disputes, was outmatched. He had no evidence, only the word of the town. Against Kate's iron will, it wasn't enough. He left. Behind the closed door, Kate didn't punish her sons. She praised them. They had stood up to the rich man. They had shown they wouldn't be looked down upon. The neighbors whispered that the boys were wild, that they were a menace. Kate heard the whispers. She didn't care. In her mind, the world wasn't just jealous of her boys. It was afraid of them. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The family was becoming an island of defiance in a sea of resentment. It was them against everyone. And soon, this small Missouri town would not be big enough to contain the storm she was brewing. By the 1910s, the Barker family had worn out their welcome in rural Missouri. They were pariahs, so they packed their few belongings and moved, not to another quiet farm, but to the belly of the beast, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa in those days was a city on fire. It was the oil capital of the world, a chaotic boomtown where fortunes were made overnight and lost in a poker game. The air smelled of crude oil and sawdust. The streets were a frantic mix of shiny new automobiles and mud-caked wagons. And where there is that much money, that much chaos, there is always crime. For the Barker boys, Tulsa was paradise. In the Ozarks, everyone knew their name. In the sprawling, anonymous neighborhoods of Tulsa, they were ghosts. They quickly fell in with a local group of delinquents known as the Central Park Gang. These were tougher, more sophisticated criminals than the farm boys they were used to. They didn't just steal chickens, they stole cars. They didn't just break windows, they broke into warehouses. The Barker boys, with their rural ferocity and complete lack of fear, didn't just join the gang, they took it over. And Kate's role evolved. She was no longer just the defender, she became the director. Their small rental house became the gang's headquarters. It was the safe house, the armory, the planning room. She would sit at her kitchen table, listening to the boys and their friends plot their next move, offering advice on alibis and escape routes. She was the den mother to a pack of wolves. Most mothers teach their kids to say please and thank you. Ma taught hers how to spot a plainclothes detective from a block away. George Barker couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't the life he wanted. He saw his sons turning into hardened criminals, and his wife wasn't just allowing it, she was encouraging it. He was a good man trapped in a bad story. After one final explosive argument with Kate, he packed a bag and walked out the door. He never came back. For Kate, his departure wasn't a tragedy. It was a relief. The last voice of conscience in the family was gone. Now, there were no breaks. The crimes grew bolder. Petty theft turned into armed robbery. They would hit pharmacies for cash and narcotics. They'd stick up gas stations on the edge of town. They learned the rhythm of the city, the shift changes of the police, the places where a fast car could disappear into the night. Tulsa was their university, and they were graduating with honors in burglary, larceny, and armed assault. The boys started getting arrested. Lloyd went to prison in 1922. Arthur followed in 1923. But for Kate, a prison sentence wasn't a mark of shame. It was a badge of honor. It meant her boys were soldiers in the war against the system. But petty theft was just practice. The classroom lessons were over. The graduation exam was coming, and it would be written in blood. Of all her sons, Herman was the oldest, and in many ways, the one who most embodied Kate's raw, untamed spirit. He was quick-tempered, reckless, and utterly fearless. While his brothers were serving time, Herman was out on the road, leaving a trail of small-time robberies across the Midwest. He was building a reputation. In August of 1927, that reputation caught up with him. Herman and two accomplices robbed a store in Newton, Kansas. During the getaway, they were pulled over by a local police officer, a man named J.E. Marshall. Marshall was a young chief of police, well-liked in the community. He thought he was dealing with simple speeders. He walked up to the driver's side window. He likely asked for a license. What he got was a bullet. Herman shot him point blank. The car screeched away, leaving the young officer dying on the side of the road. The murder of a police chief was not like robbing a gas station. This was a direct assault on the system itself. An enormous manhunt was launched immediately. Hundreds of lawmen and deputized citizens fanned out across the state, creating a dragnet that Herman couldn't escape. For 2 days, he ran. He crashed his car, then fled on foot, hiding in cornfields and barns. The chase ended near Wichita. He was wounded, exhausted, and cornered. As the police posse closed in, he knew it was over. There would be no trial. In those days, a cop killer was unlikely to make it to the courthouse alive. And Herman Barker, raised on the Ozark Code of Defiance, was not going to be taken. He put the barrel of his pistol to his temple. The news reached Kate back in Tulsa. It wasn't delivered by a sympathetic officer. She read about it in the newspaper. Her oldest boy, her fiercest wolf, gone. Any other mother would have collapsed in grief. But Kate's grief was different. It wasn't soft and mournful. It was hard and sharp, like a shard of glass. She saw her son's death not as the consequence of his actions, but as an act of war by the state. The police hadn't just cornered a criminal. They had murdered her child. She had to go to Wichita to claim the body. She stood in the cold, sterile morgue and looked down at Herman's face. The anger in that room was a physical force. She didn't cry for mercy for his soul. She didn't whisper words of forgiveness. She looked at her dead son and made another vow, a silent one. The world had taken her boy. So she and her remaining sons would take everything they could from the world. There would be no more small-time jobs, no more petty scores. From now on, they would make the system pay. The grief didn't break her. It focused her. It burned away the last traces of caution and turned her simmering resentment into a cold, white-hot rage. She didn't cry for mercy. She cried for revenge, and she would get it. After Herman's death, the Barker gang was a ship without a rudder. They had rage, they had firepower, but they had no direction. Their methods were clumsy, their scores were small, and the heat was getting worse. Kate knew that revenge required more than just anger. It required a brain. Then, in 1931, her son Fred was released from prison, and he brought a friend home to meet his mother. His name was Alvin Karpis. He was nothing like the Barker boys. He wasn't a product of the Ozark Hills. He was a cold, quiet Canadian with a photographic memory and the emotional range of a reptile. He rarely raised his voice, and he had a strange, unsettling smile that never reached his eyes. It earned him the nickname Creepy Karpis. Fred and Karpis had met in the Kansas State Penitentiary. For career criminals, prison wasn't rehabilitation. It was a business conference. In the bleak landscape of the prison yard, they formed a partnership. Fred had the unthinking loyalty of his family. Karpis had a brilliant, methodical mind for crime. He read books on military strategy and studied the mistakes of other outlaw gangs. He was a professional in a world of angry amateurs. When Fred brought Karpis to the family safe house, it was an audition. Kate Barker looked at this quiet, sinister man, and she saw the key to everything. Her boys were hammers, good for smashing through doors. But Karpis was the architect who could draw the blueprint for the entire heist. He was the strategist she needed for her war. The Barker-Karpis Gang was born, and it was a terrifyingly effective machine. It had the raw muscle and loyalty of Fred and Arthur Barker. It had a network of corrupt doctors, crooked lawyers, and underworld contacts. And now, it had the cold, calculating intellect of Alvin Karpis to direct the entire orchestra. Kate's role transformed once again. She became the ultimate piece of camouflage. The gang would move into a new town, and she would be the one to rent a large, comfortable house in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. She'd introduce herself as Mrs. Anderson or Mrs. Hunter. She would buy groceries, go to church, and hang laundry in the backyard. She was the friendly, harmless old woman who lived next door. No one would ever guess that in the basement of that house, her sons were cleaning machine guns and counting stacks of stolen money. Her very presence was the perfect alibi. She was the secret weapon. They traveled across the Midwest, a moving fortress of crime hidden behind a veneer of domestic bliss. They were the perfect family, except their luggage was filled with hand grenades and spare ammunition for their Thompson submachine guns. Under Karpis's guidance, their operations became slick and professional. They planned their jobs with military precision, studying blueprints of banks, timing police patrols, and mapping out multiple escape routes. They were no longer just reacting, they were hunting. With the team assembled, they looked at the map, and they chose their targets. The years 1931 and 1932 were the golden age of the Barker-Karpis Gang. They descended on the American Midwest like a plague. Their name became a whisper of fear in every small-town bank and every police precinct from Minnesota to Texas. This wasn't like the lone wolf attacks of other outlaws. This was organized, relentless, and brutally efficient. Imagine a typical morning in a place like Fort Scott, Kansas. The bank manager is unlocking the vault. The tellers are counting their cash drawers. The sun is shining. And then, a black sedan, long and heavy, rolls quietly to a stop outside. 4 men get out. They are not wearing masks. In fact, they are dressed in neat business suits, looking like salesmen or accountants. They walk into the bank, and for a moment, nobody even notices. Then, Alvin Karpis clears his throat. His voice is calm, almost polite. He announces that this is a robbery, and before the shock can even register on the teller's face, the other men have produced their weapons. Not just pistols, Thompson submachine guns. In the quiet, marble-floored bank, the sight of a Tommy gun was like seeing a dragon. It was a weapon of war, and it paralyzed everyone with sheer terror. The robbery would be over in less than 3 minutes. They moved with a silent, rehearsed precision. One man watched the door. Another vaulted over the counter to empty the cash drawers. Fred Barker, with a sawed-off shotgun, would control the lobby. Karpis would handle the vault. There was no yelling, no panic, just cold, professional work. They took the cash, walked calmly back to their car, and drove away, obeying the speed limit. By the time the police arrived, they were already miles down a pre-planned escape route, heading towards a safe house in a different state. They hit banks in Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas. They left a trail of empty vaults and terrified witnesses, and they were ghosts. They used multiple stolen cars, switching them at designated points. They had a network of mechanics who could modify their vehicles for speed and durability. They seemed to be everywhere at once. But it wasn't just banks. They saw the entire system as their personal treasury. They robbed a payroll shipment in Missouri, walking away with the modern equivalent of $500,000. They staged a daring jewel heist in Kansas City, and they were violent. They didn't hesitate. In December of 1931, they were involved in a shootout in West Plains, Missouri, that ended with the town's sheriff, C.R. Kelly, dead on the pavement. He was a husband and a father. To the gang, he was just an obstacle. The body count was rising. They killed at least 2 police officers during this period and were suspected in several other murders. Their reputation grew with every headline. The newspapers called them the Phantom Gang. Law enforcement was baffled, outgunned, and outsmarted at every turn. They were accumulating a fortune. But for Kate, it wasn't just about the money anymore. Every successful robbery was a punch in the face to the system that had taken her son. Every dead lawman was a settling of the score. The banks had guards, the payrolls had escorts. But the gang was about to discover a new kind of target. A target that was soft, vulnerable, and couldn't fight back. By 1933, robbing banks was getting harder. Alarms were improving. Police response times were getting faster. The risk was increasing, but the rewards were staying the same. Alvin Karpis, ever the strategist, saw the flaw in their business model. He decided it was time to change the product. Instead of stealing a bank's money, they would steal the banker himself. The logic was cold and simple. A building is just brick and mortar, but a human life was an asset with unlimited value. Their first target was William Hamm Jr., the president of the Hamm's Brewing Company in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was a wealthy, respected public figure. On a June afternoon in 1933, as Hamm was walking from his office to his car, a sedan pulled up to the curb. Before he could react, he was pulled inside, and the car sped away. It was over in seconds. The Barker-Karpis gang didn't send a ransom note scribbled on cheap paper. They were more sophisticated than that. They communicated with the family through coded messages placed in the classified ads of the newspaper. It was anonymous, brilliant, and terrifying. The demand was $100,000. In today's money, that's over $2 million. The Hamm family, desperate to get their patriarch back alive, paid without question. The money was dropped off at a remote location. 4 days after he was taken, William Hamm was released, unharmed, on a quiet country road. The gang had executed the perfect crime, and they had discovered the most profitable business in America. 7 months later, they struck again. This time, the target was Edward Bremer, another prominent St. Paul banker. The abduction was just as clean, just as professional. On the morning of January 17, 1934, Bremer was on his way to work when his car was forced to the side of the road. He was taken at gunpoint. This time, the gang was feeling confident. They knew the playbook, and they doubled the price. They demanded $200,000 for Edward Bremer's life. Let that number sink in. $200,000 during the Great Depression. It's the equivalent of nearly $4.5 million today. And they didn't want a wire transfer. They wanted cash, a mountain of untraceable bills. For 3 weeks, the Bremer family lived in a state of quiet terror. The entire city held its breath. The kidnappings had changed everything. The wealthy elite of the Midwest suddenly realized that their money couldn't protect them. Their high walls and private security were useless against a ghost gang that could snatch you in broad daylight. Like the Hamm family, the Bremers paid the full amount. Edward Bremer was released, shaken but alive. The Barker-Karpis gang was now fantastically wealthy. They were sitting on a fortune that could last them a lifetime. They were at the absolute pinnacle of the criminal underworld. They had outsmarted local police, terrorized 2 cities, and held the lives of powerful men in their hands. They felt invincible. But with that kind of money and that kind of attention comes a different kind of heat. This wasn't a local matter anymore. The Bremer family had friends in very high places, including the White House. The full, unstoppable weight of the United States federal government was about to come crashing down on them. The Bremer kidnapping was a fatal mistake. It was too big, too loud. It had personally angered President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it gave a man named J. Edgar Hoover the justification he had been looking for. The hunt was no longer a state matter. It was federal. The first thing the FBI did was brilliant in its simplicity. They checked the ransom money. Before delivering the cash, agents had recorded the serial numbers of every single bill. Now, that money was poison. Every time a member of the gang spent a $20 bill at a gas station or a diner, they were leaving a breadcrumb. The gang knew this. They were rich, but they were trapped. They were the most famous criminals in the country, and their faces were on wanted posters in every post office. Alvin Karpis, always thinking 3 steps ahead, decided they needed to disappear. Not by moving to a new city, but by literally becoming new people. They needed to change their faces, and they needed to erase their fingerprints. In the criminal underworld, there was a man whispered about for this kind of work. His name was Joseph Moran. He was a disgraced doctor, a drunkard, and an underworld surgeon who operated out of the back rooms of seedy Chicago apartments. For a high price, he would perform procedures no sane doctor would ever attempt. In late 1934, the core members of the gang went to see him. Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis wanted the full treatment. They wanted new faces and new fingertips. Imagine the scene. A dimly lit room that smells of whiskey and antiseptic. The operating table is just a mattress on the floor. There is no proper anesthesia, only a bottle of cheap liquor to dull the pain. Dr. Moran, his hands shaking slightly from his own addictions, goes to work with a scalpel. He made incisions in their faces, trying to alter their features. He worked on Karpis's nose. He tried to give Fred Barker a different jawline. It was crude, brutal butchery. But the worst part was the fingerprints. Moran took the scalpel and painstakingly sliced away the distinctive whorls and ridges from the tips of their fingers. Then, to ensure they never grew back the same, he would apply a caustic acid to the raw wounds. The pain must have been unimaginable, a white-hot agony that went on for hours. Fred and Karpis endured it. They paid Moran thousands of dollars for his horrific work. When it was over, their faces were swollen and scarred, their hands wrapped in thick bandages. They had paid a fortune to be mutilated. They thought this would make them invisible. They were wrong. The facial surgery was a failure. It left them with noticeable scars, but didn't fundamentally change their appearance. And the fingerprint removal? It was even worse. When their fingers healed, the scar tissue formed new, unique patterns. In a way, Moran's procedure had made their fingerprints even more identifiable than before. It was a desperate medieval solution to a modern problem, and it showed the first real crack in the gang's cool professionalism. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted, and they were running scared. They could change their faces, They could burn their fingertips, but they couldn't change who was hunting them. While the Barker-Karpis gang was hiding in dark rooms, enduring the surgeon's knife, a different kind of operation was taking shape in Washington, D.C. It was an operation of paper, ink, and public relations, and it was being orchestrated by one of the most powerful and ambitious men in America, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was the director of the new and still unproven Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the early 1930s, the FBI was seen by many as a joke. They were derisively called G-men, and local police departments resented their interference. They had no major victories to their name. Hoover needed a win. More than that, he needed a war. The public enemy era gave him exactly that. Outlaws like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson were running wild. Hoover used their headlines to transform his agency. He secured more funding, more manpower, and the right for his agents to carry firearms and make arrests. He was building an empire, and the bodies of famous outlaws were the bricks and mortar. By 1934, Dillinger, Floyd, and Nelson were all dead, gunned down in spectacular FBI ambushes. Hoover was a national hero, but a hero needs a villain. With the most famous male gangsters gone, Hoover needed a new dragon to slay, and his eyes fell on the Barker-Karpis gang. He declared Alvin Karpis the new public enemy #1. But Karpis was just a man. Hoover needed something more, something that would capture the public's imagination, something that sounded more sinister, more unnatural. And that's when he found Ma. The FBI's own field reports from the time barely mention her. Informants and captured gang members described her as a hanger-on, a loyal mother who simply tagged along with her criminal sons. They said she had no role in planning the robberies or the kidnappings. She was just there. But that wasn't the story Hoover wanted to tell. He began to craft a new narrative. Through press releases and carefully orchestrated leaks to his favorite reporters, the FBI painted a picture of a criminal mastermind. They took the image of a harmless old woman and twisted it into something monstrous. She wasn't just a mother. She was the matriarch of crime, the bloody mother, the evil genius who directed her son's every move from the shadows. Hoover called her the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. Was it true? Or was it a fabrication? A piece of propaganda designed for a specific purpose? Think about it. Which headline is more shocking? FBI kills hardened criminal, or FBI kills evil grandmother? Hoover knew that to justify a war, you need a monster. And if a monster doesn't exist, you create one. He made Kate Barker into a legend, a terrifying folk devil. He put her on the same level as Al Capone. It was a brilliant move. The American public was horrified and fascinated by the idea of a killer grandma. The new narrative was set. Kate Ma Barker, the quiet woman from the Ozarks who loved jigsaw puzzles, was now the most wanted woman in America, a dragon in an apron. The net was tightening. The FBI's vast resources were now focused on this one family, and a single careless mistake was all it would take to pull the string. The mistake didn't come from Ma or Fred, who were hiding deep in the Florida swamps. It didn't come from Alvin Karpis, who was too clever to get caught. It came from the forgotten son, Arthur Doc Barker. Doc was not a brilliant criminal. He was a follower, a brute who did what he was told. After the Bremer kidnapping, he had taken his share of the ransom money and gone to Chicago, trying to lay low. But a man like Doc Barker doesn't know how to be a ghost. He was careless. He liked fancy suits, expensive cars, and the nightlife. He was spending the poisoned money. On January 8, 1935, FBI agents, acting on a tip from tracking the Bremer ransom bills, surrounded a dingy apartment on the north side of Chicago. They didn't expect a major shootout. They knew their target. When Doc Barker opened his door, he was met with the cold, hard reality of 5 federal agents and their guns. He surrendered without a fight. For J. Edgar Hoover, the arrest was a major victory. But Doc Barker wasn't the real prize. The real prize was what he might know. Agents began a meticulous search of his apartment. They ripped up floorboards, checked behind walls, and sifted through every piece of paper. For hours, they found nothing. Just clothes, liquor bottles, and the sad remnants of a life on the run. It seemed like a dead end. Then, an agent opened a small closet. Pushed to the back, underneath a pile of old newspapers, was a travel case. Inside, among some spare clothes, was a map. It was a cheap, folded tourist map of the state of Florida. The kind you get for free at a gas station. At first glance, it was meaningless. But the agent, trained to look for the smallest detail, unfolded it completely. And there it was. A faint circle drawn in pencil over a tiny, insignificant dot on the map. The dot was next to a lake called Lake Weir, and the name of the town was Ocklawaha. Next to the circle, a small, scribbled note. It read, "John's Place." The agents in the room gathered around. Was this it? Was this where the last of the Barker gang was hiding? It was a long shot. A single map found in the closet of a low-level thug. It could be an old vacation spot. It could mean nothing at all. But it was the only lead they had. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover was notified. He didn't hesitate. He gave the order to mobilize every available agent in the region. He wasn't going to let this chance slip away. The FBI agents in that Chicago apartment looked at the map. Then they looked at each other. The hunt was on. It was time to go to Florida. Ocklawaha, Florida. In 1935, it wasn't a town so much as a suggestion of one. A sleepy, humid backwater on the edge of the Ocala National Forest. The air here felt ancient, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like gray beards, and the dark, tannin-stained water of Lake Weir moved with a lazy, prehistoric slowness. This is a place of things that hide. Alligators float just beneath the surface, looking like harmless logs until the moment they strike. Snakes coil in the shade, invisible to the untrained eye. It was the perfect place for a family of predators to go to ground. Here, in a rented two-story white cottage right on the lake, Ma Barker and her last free son, Fred, were living out their final days. They were known to the locals as Mrs. Blackburn and her son. They paid their rent in cash, and they kept to themselves. The neighbors saw a quiet, unassuming pair. They saw the old lady sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, doing jigsaw puzzles. They saw her son Fred going out on the lake to fish, or driving into town for groceries. He was polite and always called her Ma'am in public. They seemed perfectly normal. A mother and son enjoying a quiet retirement in the Florida sun. But the locals also noticed odd things. The Blackburns never opened their windows, even on the hottest days. They had no friends, and they never invited anyone over. And sometimes, late at night, the fishermen out on the lake would hear a strange, rhythmic clattering sound coming from the house. It was the sound of a Thompson submachine gun being fired in short, controlled bursts out into the water. Fred was practicing. The neighbors thought they were a nice mother and son. They didn't know the son slept with a rifle by his bed. They didn't know the mother's handbag contained a pistol. And they didn't know that their quiet little corner of the world was about to become a battlefield. On the night of January 15th, the hunters arrived. They came not in a rush of sirens, but in a silent, creeping wave. Car after car of FBI agents rolled down the dark, sandy roads, their headlights off. They moved under the cover of darkness, surrounding the property. They lay in the damp grass and the palmetto bushes. They took up positions in the neighboring orange groves. They watched the house, a silent white tomb in the moonlight. They could see a single light on in an upstairs window. Inside, Ma and Fred were oblivious. They had no idea that the world had found them. They had no idea that their isolated refuge was now a cage, and the bars were made of 14 federal agents with rifles and machine guns. All through the long, cold hours of the early morning, the agents waited. They waited for the sun. The sun came up, and an agent picked up a megaphone. Dawn in Florida is a quiet, gradual thing. The sky slowly shifts from black to a deep purple, then to a soft, hazy gray. On the morning of January 16th, it was the last sunrise Ma Barker and her son Fred would ever see. The silence was broken by a sound that did not belong in the natural world. It was the loud, metallic squawk of a megaphone. The voice that boomed across the water was flat and official. Surrender. This is the FBI. You are completely surrounded. Inside the house, imagine that moment. The sudden, violent intrusion of reality. Perhaps they were asleep. The voice must have felt like a part of a nightmare. They would have gone to the window, peering carefully through the blinds, and they would have seen them, shapes moving in the pre-dawn gloom, the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel. The realization must have hit them like a physical blow. The running was over. The megaphone crackled again. Come out one at a time, with your hands in the air. You will not be harmed. What do you do in that moment? Your world has shrunk to the four walls of a single room. Outside, the law. Inside, your family. Do you think about surrender? About a trial? About life in a prison cell? Fred Barker might have. He was only 33 years old, but he was in that room with his mother. A woman forged in the Ozark Code, a code that said you don't bow to the law. You don't surrender to the enemy. A prison cell, to her, was a fate worse than death. It was a cage, and a wolf does not belong in a cage. We can only imagine the frantic, whispered conversation in that upstairs room, the final choice. For the agents lying in the wet grass, the wait was agonizing. Every second stretched into an eternity. The air was damp and cold. They listened. They watched. They saw a curtain move in an upstairs window, and then they heard a voice. It wasn't the voice of surrender. It was a woman's voice, high and thin, but filled with a lifetime of defiance. The agents closest to the house heard it clearly. I ain't coming out. And then another sound. The unmistakable sharp crack of a Thompson submachine gun firing a single shot from the house. A bullet ripped through the morning air and kicked up a cloud of dust just feet from an agent's head. That was the answer. That single shot was the signal. Hell was about to break loose. The single shot from the house was a declaration of war, and the FBI responded with a tidal wave of firepower. There was no order given, no coordinated plan. It was a primal, furious reaction. 14 men, armed with the most powerful portable weapons of their time, all opened fire on the white cottage at once. The sound was a physical thing, a solid wall of noise that shattered the morning peace and sent flocks of birds screeching into the sky from miles away. It was not a gunfight. A gunfight implies an exchange. This was an annihilation. Imagine the scene from the inside. One moment, you are in a quiet bedroom. The next, the world is coming apart around you. Bullets punched through the thin wooden walls as if they were paper. They didn't just make holes, they tore out chunks of wood, creating a blizzard of splinters. Windows didn't just break, they vaporized into dust. A mirror on the wall explodes, a vase on a nightstand disintegrates, the plaster on the ceiling cracks and falls in a white sheet. The very air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and sawdust. From outside, the agents saw their bullets stitching lines across the white paint of the house. They took cover behind cars, behind citrus trees, and just kept firing. They emptied clip after clip. They reloaded, their hands shaking with adrenaline, and they fired again. The roar was continuous, a sustained, 4-hour-long earthquake of violence. Did Ma and Fred fire back? The FBI claimed they did. They said they could hear the distinctive, slower thump, thump, thump of the Tommy gun answering their barrage. But how could anyone hear anything in that storm of lead? How could anyone even stand, let alone aim and fire, in a room that was being systematically dismantled by a hail of steel? The house was shaking so hard from the constant impact of the bullets, the dishes in the kitchen cabinets rattled and fell to the floor, smashing into 1,000 pieces. The agents fired rifles, they fired shotguns, they fired machine guns, they even fired tear gas canisters through the shattered windows, but the wind coming off the lake blew the gas right back out. For 4 hours this went on. 4 hours. It's an almost unimaginable amount of time for a continuous firefight. Local townspeople gathered on the far side of the lake to watch the spectacle. To them, it looked like the house was being consumed by a swarm of invisible, angry insects. It was a siege against 2 people. It was the full, unrestrained power of the federal government being unleashed on a single, fragile wooden structure. And then, after 4 hours and 15 minutes, it stopped. The order was given to cease fire, and a silence fell over Lake Weir. A ringing, impossible, deafening silence. The silence that followed the storm was heavy and unnatural. For several long minutes, not a single agent moved. The only sound was the ringing in their own ears. The white cottage stood before them, not as a house, but as a carcass. It was riddled, torn, and violated. Slowly, cautiously, they began to move forward. They advanced in a semicircle, their weapons still raised, stepping over the shredded remains of what was once a garden. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder and fresh-cut pine. They reached the porch. The rocking chair Ma Barker used to sit in was overturned, its wood splintered and pocked with bullet holes. The front door was gone, blasted off its hinges. The doorway was just a dark, gaping wound. One by one, the agents stepped inside. The crunch of shattered glass and plaster under their boots was deafening in the stillness. The inside of the house was a scene of unbelievable destruction. Sunlight streamed through the hundreds of bullet holes in the walls, creating an eerie cathedral-like effect. Dust motes danced in the bright shafts of light. Every piece of furniture was overturned, shredded, and broken. The floor was a carpet of debris, shell casings, splinters, and the sad, scattered pieces of a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. They cleared the ground floor. Nothing. The real test was the staircase. They went up slowly, their footsteps echoing in the wrecked house. They reached the top landing. There were 2 bedrooms. They chose the one facing the lake. They kicked open the door. The room was a slaughterhouse of wood and plaster, and in the middle of it all, they found them. Fred Barker was crumpled on the floor between the bed and the window. He had been hit multiple times. His Thompson submachine gun was beside him. It was clear he had been the one firing back, fighting until the very last moment. And then, in the corner, they saw her. Arizona Ma Barker. She was slumped in a chair, still wearing her long dress. She was 61 years old. In her final moments, she hadn't been cowering. She had been in the line of fire, beside her son. A single Tommy gun lay on the floor near her hand. The agent stood in silence, looking at the scene. This was the great criminal mastermind. This was the monster from the headlines. She looked small, old. They searched the rest of the house. It was an arsenal. They found multiple machine guns, 10 pistols, 2 shotguns, and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. They had been prepared for a war, and a war is what they got. Outside, the press was arriving. Photographers and reporters swarmed the police lines, their flashbulbs popping. The news of the shootout was already spreading across the country. The agents brought the bodies out on stretchers, covered in white sheets. The cameras clicked, capturing the final undignified exit of the Barker gang. The bodies were cold. But the legend, the myth that J. Edgar Hoover had so carefully constructed, was just heating up. J. Edgar Hoover got his dragon. The story of the Florida shootout was a public relations masterpiece. The headlines screamed about the bloody benders of the 20th century and the she-wolf who died with a machine gun in her hands. The photograph of the bullet-riddled house became an iconic image of the FBI's total victory over the public enemy era. Hoover's legend and the legend of his G-men was secure. But almost immediately, a different story began to emerge. A story told not by the press or the FBI, but by the criminals who had actually known her. Alvin Karpis, after he was eventually captured, was asked about Ma Barker's role. He just laughed. He said she was the most non-criminal person I ever met. He claimed she had no idea how to plan a robbery, couldn't handle a gun, and that her main contribution was cooking meals and nagging them to clean their rooms. Other underworld figures agreed. They said she was just an old countrywoman who was fiercely loyal to her sons, a relic from another time who was simply swept up in their violent world. So which is it? Was she the evil genius, the matriarch of murder that Hoover created? Or was she a harmless, deluded mother, a victim of her own blind love and a government that needed a villain? The truth, as it so often is more complicated than either story. Ma Barker was probably not a criminal mastermind. She likely never drew a single blueprint of a bank or planned an escape route. That was Alvin Karpis's job. She didn't have the cold, calculating mind of a true strategist. But to say she was innocent is to miss the point entirely. She wasn't the gang's brain. She was its heart. She was its soul. She was the source of the poison. She was the one who taught her sons, from their earliest days, that the world was the enemy. She was the one who instilled in them that deep, Ozark-born hatred of authority. She was the one who taught them that loyalty to family, to the clan, was the only law that mattered. She may not have planned the crimes, but she created the criminals. The Barker-Karpis gang was different from the others. Dillinger was a charming rogue. Bonnie and Clyde were tragic lovers. But the Barkers were a family. Their violence wasn't just business. It felt personal. It was a blood feud against the entire world. And that came directly from her. In the end, she died for that belief. Trapped in that Florida cottage, she had a choice. She could have walked out. She could have surrendered and faced a trial, but that would have been a betrayal of the only code she ever knew, the code of the hills, the code that says you don't back down, you don't surrender, you fight. She wasn't a gangster queen from a Hollywood movie. She was something older, something more primal. She was the last daughter of the American frontier, a woman who carried the bitter, violent spirit of the 19th century Ozarks into the roaring engine of the 20th century. And the collision was spectacular. J. Edgar Hoover was wrong. Ma Barker wasn't the most dangerous criminal brain in America. She was something far more common and far more terrifying. She was a mother who loved her children so much, she forgot the difference between protecting them and destroying them.